This is a production of WKNO Memphis. Production funding for this program is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
George, what was interesting I found out talking before we started the program was your background in politics. And as a journalist, you started in that vein, which surprised me because I thought you've always done sports since you've been doing sports talk radio for 43 years and was the sports editor and a columnist at the Press Seminar, that it was always the sports background. But tell everybody about the start of your broadcast and journalistic career in the realm of politics.
Well, I didn't start in politics. I started off like every other reporter at a newspaper, writing obituaries.
Oh, obituaries.
I was the last person that Ed Meeman hired when he was editor of the paper. And Ed Meeman was a well-known editor across the country. But I didn't get anything special. I mean, I wasn't sought after.
You worked your way up.
I just did the best I could and went out. We had a column that was in the paper every day called In Your Neighborhood, and all the young reporters on Saturdays at noon, we'd have to leave because all the young reporters had to work on Saturdays.
Right.
We'd go out and we were assigned a city block. Mr. Meeman's policy was there's a story in every house. And so we would knock on doors and tell them we were the In Your Neighborhood reporter and could we come in and talk. And they would let us come in and I would, we'd ask questions and darned if there weren't stories in every house. And we'd write probably a 12, 14 paragraph story about this family. And it ran every single day in the paper. There'd be 4 or 5 of us out there doing it every single Saturday. So that was grunt work, and that's how I started.
So how do you move up the ladder, and how do you differentiate yourselves from other reporters to move into that political arena? Because that's what you wanted to do. You wanted to be in Washington, D.C., covering politics, covering the government.
My goal when I started work was to be a Washington correspondent.
Right.
That's what I wanted to be. I don't really remember how I backed into doing political stuff. At one point, they made me assistant Mid-South editor. We had Mid-South editions. One went to Arkansas, went to West Tennessee, went to North Mississippi, and so we had to cover those things. And so as the assistant Mid-South editor, the Mid-South editor would sit there and he would be the inside guy. But I would go out and cover state houses in Nashville and in Little Rock and in Jackson and gubernatorial elections and Senate elections, and it just kept rolling and rolling. It became like an avalanche, and pretty soon I was pretty much on a first-name basis with Winthrop Rockefeller in Little Rock. Never will forget, he had personally invited me to his house when he had as his house guest George Romney.
Wow.
And Romney was making a speech, and my wife and I went. It was great. And, I was doing exactly what I wanted to do. And then there was a big U.S. Senate subcommittee investigating welfare abuses on Native American reservations in New Mexico and on primarily on properties in the Delta in Mississippi that were worked, but not owned, but worked primarily by African Americans. And the abuses weren't by people receiving the welfare, it was by people doling out the welfare. And on this committee were Senators Joe Clark from Pennsylvania and George Murphy from California and Gaylord Nelson and Winston Prouty and Robert F. Kennedy. And there were major hearings for about 2 or 3 days in Jackson. And I was on this, I was covering this whole story, and Kennedy and Joe Clark pretty much were the committee. I mean, maybe Jacob Javits was on that committee too. That would have been unusual. Because that would have made 2 senators from New York on the same committee. But I think he was on that committee too. But then we left, and not all the senators went. I would sit outside the Downtowner Hotel in Jackson with a glass of scotch, and Bobby Kennedy would have a glass of scotch, and we'd be sitting in these lounge chairs by swimming pools, and we would talk about everything. Now, this was in the 60s, and the Yankees were bad. This was everything from the downfall of the Yankees when CBS owned them to Winthrop Rockefeller. He was real interested in Winthrop Rockefeller and their whole Rockefeller family politically. And we'd talk about everything. And we flew around in the Delta in this little Martin 404 plane. And for some reason, I guess Kennedy took a liking to me. He always insisted that I sit with him on the plane. And there were some great stories. We approached a little shack one day, and this whole tour in the Delta had been set up by Marian Wright, now Marian Wright Edelman, and she's head of the Children's Defense Fund. But by then, at that time, she was very involved in the Mississippi NAACP, and we knocked on this door, and she had clued Bobby Kennedy on the name of the people who lived in the house. And we were designated reporters, pool reporters, because there weren't enough room for all of us to go. There were only about 7 or 8 reporters, counting the 3 networks and the New York Times and the Washington Post and the New Orleans Times-Picayune, and little old me, who didn't know anything. And Kennedy knocked on the door, and this African-American couple answered the door, and his eyes got this big. And he said, why, you're Mr. Bobby Kennedy. And Kennedy's response was, and you're Mr. Sam Houston Smith, because Marian Wright had told him his name. And it was great. The whole thing was great. I got back in filthy dirty one afternoon after 3 or 4 days out in the Delta and dirt and everything else, and got into the office around 4 o'clock, and our editor was Charlie Snyder, and he said he'd like to see me in his office, and I said, oh gosh, I must have messed up on this trip, something awful, written some terrible things.
You heard about the scotch with Bobby Kennedy.
It's terrible things. And he called me in and he said, how would you like to go to the sports department next week? And I said, Mr. Snyder, I really don't think I want to go. I'm really enjoying what I'm doing, and it's getting me closer and closer, I think, to my goal. And he said, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. If you go to the sports department next week, the following week, we're going to make our sports editor, he's going to become sports editor emeritus, and I'm going to name you sports editor, and here's what you're going to be making, which was significantly above the poverty wages I was making then. And I said, Mr. Snyder, you got yourself a sports editor. And that was somewhere in the mid-'60s, and ever since then, that's what I've done.
It's been sports, but you've never lost that passion for the political avenue that you went down. I mean, you've always had that passion, right?
No, I've always had that passion. I know when RFK was assassinated, I was a political dropout for a while. I liked him a lot. Say what you will. I know he was a good guy, and I know there are people probably who were Ole Miss fans back in those days who couldn't stand him because
but personally, having dealt with him, it must have really hurt you.
I personally dealt with him, and we corresponded before his assassination, and I saw something on that trip that was unbelievable, Greg. I saw him go out the back door of one of these shacks and into one of the shacks next door. It was owned by a very prominent person in Mississippi, this farm. And when I saw that, nobody else saw it. So I went to the front door of the shack, and I opened the door, and Kennedy was sitting on this filthy floor. He had on a beautiful gray pinstripe suit. He was sitting on the floor holding about an 18-month-old child with a distended stomach who had been eating dried beans off this filthy floor, and tears were rolling down Kennedy's cheek. And I closed the door and walked away. I thought, this is just very private and personal. I never wrote about it until he was assassinated, and I wrote an opposite editorial page column about that some of those things that I thought I hadn't written on that trip. I wrote about them then. Yeah, I miss politics. I still miss covering politics. And even like doing my radio show on 9/11, I was on the air from the moment it happened. I watched it on our TV monitor while I was on the air doing my morning talk show, and I stayed on radio the rest of that day doing not sports, but 9/11 related things.
Right.
I talked to people at the Memphis airport about how it affected them, interviewed them on the air, talked to people at FedEx about how it affected FedEx, because nothing was fine anywhere. I talked to the National Guard people here, because they were put on the alert.
Just using your journalistic skills
Yeah,
in the news.
I was on all day till at least 5 or 5:30, maybe
Right.
6 or 6:30, from that early in the morning. I didn't know we were under attack when the first plane hit. Jeff Moore, the former pro football
Right.
player, was on with me, and it was on a Tuesday, and he was on with me on Tuesdays, and we were talking about NFL games from the past week and the ones upcoming. And I saw the first plane hit, and I said, gosh, something terrible's happened, awful accident. And then I saw the second plane hit, and I said, oh my God, on the air, we're under attack.
Well, I was on the way listening to the station, and I think people know that you and I work at the same radio station, and it did become politics. It became news because that was so much more important than what we do. We talk sports.
I've had some interesting, though, experiences out of sports. I mean, I was heavily involved in the coverage of Martin Luther King's assassination. I was heavily involved in the coverage in Memphis of JFK's assassination. That day I went around to churches all over the city and covered what was happening in the churches. They were all having special services. I've been blessed, Jeff. I've had a wonderful career. I know I'm in the twilight of it now, and that's okay. I've got an illness that's probably going to get me, and but I can't complain because I've had a wonderful career.
Is there a story that you were working on that you knew would be very devastating to an individual, to a program, to a city, who knows, and you couldn't finish it for some reason? You couldn't complete it, or maybe you didn't have the information, but you knew something was there. We talked about you knew of coaches who bought players. You've probably known a lot about scandals and things that you've seen throughout your career. Was there ever one that you were holding on to and you just...
It was more than one.
Give me an example. Obviously, if you're holding on to it, you probably can't tell me, but...
Well, I've never told anybody because I think that would be violating some confidence. Even some things people told me who are no longer alive. I've never said anything that we couldn't write that I knew about, but I couldn't prove it. I just haven't. I have not talked about that, nor am I gonna.
What was when you went out to cover a story, how many sources did you need to go with it?
Two. And an embarrassing moment for me is we broke a story at Channel 3 that was incorrect. And I took the hit for it. I went on the air and said, it's my fault. I'm sports editor here, it's my fault.
You remember the story?
Yeah, it had to do with Paris London, the basketball player. And we said that he had left the team. Our reporter who got that story, he had left the team and didn't get on the bus to go to a game in Little Rock, I believe. But he did get the bus before it got out of Memphis, which our reporter didn't know. But he hadn't checked two sources. And my rule always would be, you better get it from two unimpeachable sources before we broke it.
I don't know if you remember this, but I've done a lot of play-by-play for Memphis. And I was in Fayetteville doing the game versus Arkansas. Yeah. And that's when I had heard the story came back from my station, because I was, as people know, at 24 and heard about that. And Paris was right on the bus because I was on the bus with them. So I do remember that, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. It has to be multiple sources. There are a lot of people today that go with one source.
Can't do it.
They go with speculation.
Can't do it.
And I don't think they're held responsible. The game has really changed, hasn't it, George, over the years?
Greg, I'd like to change slightly, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
The subject. One of the things in my career, which a lot of people watching right now are going to say it's been way too long, that stands out in my mind the most, is I had an unusual relationship with Muhammad Ali. I wrote a number of columns when he had his boxing license taken away, that it was unconstitutional, that he still hadn't been proven guilty of anything.
Right.
And I always said, in this country, you're innocent until proven guilty. I'd always been taught. And he hadn't been proven guilty of a thing. Eventually, he was proven not guilty, okay?
Right.
But I wrote numerous columns. He finally got his license back. And he was fighting, his first fight was against Jerry Quarry in Atlanta. And I went to cover it. And it was a spectacle. I mean, every celebrity, star, Hollywood was there. Diana Ross had on more diamonds than anybody I've ever seen. But I went into the locker room after the fight. He really cut up Quarry pretty good. And you couldn't get near Ali. But I saw Mrs. Clay sitting off in a corner by herself. And I went over and introduced myself to her. And she said, "Oh, you're that young man who's been writing those pieces about my son, saying that he should be allowed to fight." And I said, "How would you know that?" And she said, "I have a friend in Memphis who's been sending him to him." And she stood up, and there must have been 100 reporters around Ali. I couldn't get close. I was going to have to wait till I had more people cleared out. And she called him, and I never will forget this. She called him Cassius, even though he was Muhammad Ali. And she called him Cassius, "Come over here." And he came, and she introduced him to me and told him about it. He had read the columns too. And we became really good friends. There was a Parkinson's disease doctor where I was doing a lot of work at the time in business in Hilton Head. And I once rode, and he rode in a golf cart with me while Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, and I played golf in Muhammad. We met at Michael's house at Hilton Head, played at Wexford Plantation.
Oh my
Boy,
gosh.
did they bet a lot of money. And Barkley had a better swing then than he does.
So did they ask you to get into the betting?
No, not at that kind of money. But I knew I was right on Ali.
Right.
But I can remember we got close enough where he was fighting Bob Foster, and he was the light heavyweight champion in Las Vegas, and he had a suite at Caesars, and we went up. He said, "Come on up." So I went up in the suite, and he ended up plopped down on one king-size bed, and I was plopped down on the other, and we were just shooting the bull. And every once in a while, there'd be a knock on the door, and it would be his brother, who was playing blackjack or dice, shooting the dice, and Rockman wanted more money, and Muhammad would reach into his pocket and give him $300-400 bills. It'd be good. But my relationship with him was special.
What does it say about you? Here you are, this journalist, this broadcaster, and you have the people at Rhodes feeling that you have enough experience somehow to run an athletic department. You have Avron Fogelman saying you have enough to run a AA professional baseball team.
Even more, after 3 years of running it, Fogelman was in the process of buying a huge amount of properties, golf, resort, and other properties.
Did he own the Royals at this point? When did he?
Then he had, yes.
Okay.
In South Carolina, in Hilton Head.
Okay.
And somebody told Avron and his organization, "You need somebody who can go over there and run it." That person was me. So I ended up with an apartment in Hilton Head. I do my radio show from Hilton Head at night. I mean,
Are you
because
serious?
they were an hour ahead of us, see. So I'd still do that. But I
didn't know this about you.
I had 455 employees.
Tell me about Trump before we make the transition to your
Trump
work
had a
at Channel 3.
292-foot yacht. Our biggest slip was 100 feet. Okay, he comes down and he wants in our marina, and our harbor master tells him he can't come in. That's too big a boat. We can't handle it.
Right.
And it's Trump's yelling at him, screaming at him. His captain apparently called him up, and so they call me, and I go racing down there, and I said, "Mr. Trump, in Savannah, in front of the Hyatt Regency, there's a 300-foot parking place for your boat. You have to go park it down there. I'm sorry." Then he starts screaming at me. And I said, "Well, we can't accommodate you. You're liable to get stuck in our marina and can't get out." And reluctantly, after a string of 4-letter words, off he chugged to Savannah.
I told you this story before we started taping. Sunday night, I'm in my apartment. First week I'm in Memphis. I pop on the channel, and there is George Lapidus on Channel 3 with his show. How did that happen? How did that
Bob
come about?
Oak was the general manager at Channel 3. He had just come back to Memphis. Memphis was home.
Okay.
He grew up in Whitehaven, but he had been general manager. These were New York Times owned stations.
Right.
He had been general manager of the station in Fort Smith, Arkansas, which also had a station in Fayetteville. It was
Okay.
a combination station.
Right, right.
And he came back and he called two people. Norm Brewer, used to be the anchor at Channel 5, then an editorial writer at the Commercial Appeal. And he called me. We met with us separately. And he said to me, I'd like for you to join us to run our sports department. It needs somebody to run it. It needs direction. And by that time, I had left Fogelman. I was doing golf course studies on whether a golf course should be built in certain locations around the country. And my radio show. That radio show was a constant.
Just chugs on.
I wasn't going to give up that radio show. And I still would go to football games and kept up my contacts with coaches and all that. Would go to SEC media days every year until this year when I got sick. And so Bob Oath asked me to do that. We agreed on conditions, and I didn't have to appear on camera very much because, like I said, I've got a face for radio. I didn't appear much. I did that Sunday night TV show for 10 years at 10:30, and I'd get home at 11:30, 12. I'd be sleepy the next morning on radio, I can tell you.
Quick turnaround.
Yeah, it was a quick turnaround because I couldn't go right to sleep. You're still wired and geared up.
Well,
and
your
doing
juices
certain-
were flowing because you love to break stories as a journalist,
Yeah.
and you were doing that on television.
And we were getting some great interviews on that show. And my time, I got to the point where I didn't love TV. I still don't love TV news anyway, at least local TV news. I'm just not a fan of it. So I'd had enough after 10 years. And I said, you know, by then I was in my middle 60s, and I said, it's time to retire. So I did.
And I
But I
remember-
didn't retire from radio.
No, you did not. And I remember I remember your last night. The lights went out. You walked out and out the door. And I do remember that. I mean, I think a lot of people remember that.
I didn't remember
Oh,
that.
I do remember that very vividly.
I remember that both Reggie Barnes and Keith Ingram were there that night, just in the studio, watching my last show. Two good friends.
So here we are, 2013. You've cut down to 3 days a week at Sports 56.
I had to because of this lung illness.
People know about the, and real briefly again, for people who don't know, maybe they read, Jeff Calkins did a very nice story
did
about
a
that.
wonderful story.
And you talked about it on your show, but for those who don't know, George, just a little bit about
I
it.
just have this lung disease that's not really uncommon, but most people don't know anything about it for some reason, called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Nobody knows how you get it, and nobody knows how to cure it. It is fatal. I don't know how much time. I may be gone in 3 months. I may be gone.
sure hope
I
not.
may be. I don't want to be. I may be gone in 3 years. I don't really know. It's got some symptoms and side effects that I don't like, and I have to wear oxygen most of the time.
Right.
Because it is difficult to breathe. I managed to get through this without oxygen, but I'm going to need to get it as soon as we get off because my tank's right over there. But I'm going to work until I no longer can work. And
was my
I'm
next
going to
question.
lead my life and enjoy my wines and my good food and my family and my friends until I'm gone. I mean, and like I told you, I've had a wonderful career and I have zero complaints. I've made a good living. I think I've been reasonably successful. I have fabulous friends, both professional and longtime friends from preschool, as I said earlier, and an incredible family. An incredible family. The only thing I feel I'm sorry about is I'm not going to be able, I don't think, I'm sure, to see my grandchildren grow up to be young adults. I'm going to miss that a whole lot. But, Greg, we all got to go sometimes. And
all
as
do.
I've said before, there's not a person on this planet that I know of who's not terminally ill. Everybody I know is going to die. I would like to be the one exception, but I'm not. I'm not going to be, and it is what it is.
With all the success you've had in your career, who knows, George? Maybe it will be you to become that oddity. This has been a pleasure for me. I've learned a lot more about you, and I thought I already knew a lot about you. But I want to leave you with this. I want to ask you this question, and I know you're humble. What is George Lapidus' legacy when you pass, George? When you go on to heaven? And people look back at George Lapidus, what do you want to be remembered for most?
As a good husband, as a good father, as a good grandfather, and loyal to my friends.
Well said.
That's it.
George, thanks again so much for being with us. We really enjoyed it.
I did too.
Absolute pleasure.